And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and up there in Ohio, where it has been snowing today, is Larry Siegel. But I understand the
Yes,
sun's
it
coming
has.
out.
Well, it's 6 o'clock. The sun is gone for the day.
Yeah.
I cannot get used to this sun going down so early. It's crazy. I mean, in Hawaii, they didn't do the time change the same way they did, in
Uh,
Arizona, so we didn't have to worry about that. But it feels like 10 o'clock when the sun goes down.
I am not a fan of early dark. I am absolutely not, because it's like you say, and the sun is going down right now. It's 5 o'clock here in Oklahoma, and by the time this program's over, it will be dark at 6 o'clock, and you're just going, no, crazy, crazy. Well, I tell you what, it is good to be back with you, Larry. William, I contacted him today and asked him if he was
Right.
back in the States, and his airplane got delayed with all of the air traffic control and all of the mess that's going on right now. And they were going to get, I think he said, maybe I'm wrong, but I think he said that they were getting rerouted. They were having holdovers, and they were just, it was just chaotic, is what it was. And so he wasn't going to be able to be here tonight anyway. So I
Right.
appreciate you always being willing to step in. You always do such a great job. It's really great to be able to have a very reliable, very knowledgeable, uh, very intelligent and helpful stand in and volunteer when one is needed. So appreciate that very much.
You're only saying all those kind of things because they're true.
I know I'm trying to schmooze a little bit here, but I've got to tell
I'm
you,
glad to be. I'm always glad to be here. It's an honor to do the program with you.
well, I'm really, really glad to be back in the saddle. This last week, well, actually for the last week and a half, has been really, really chaotic for my family, for me, for the wife. Uh, a week ago, no, 2 weeks ago now, trying to get this right. Yeah, 2 weeks ago, my wife and I were actually supposed to be in South Carolina. We were going to take a week off,
Hmm.
which would, of course, corresponded with William being gone. And so, anyway, um, with all of the flight cancellations and this and that and the other, then we decided it would probably be a good idea not to try to take that trip. We're
Right.
glad that we didn't, because the airports on the east board, Seagate, wow, 2 3 hour layovers, or delays in getting through security, flights being canceled by the hundreds. Boy, we're really, really glad that we didn't go. And then on top of that, my brother, I think you've met my brother Gary, haven't you?
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Gary turns 81 this next week,
Wow.
and he has COPD, he has emphysema, and besides that, he's in bad health. And so he's been having real, real struggles lately. And I had pretty well decided that I needed to go up to Galena, Missouri, which is close to Branson, to visit with him. Well, then lo and behold, last Sunday, week ago this last Sunday, um, I came to my office as normal about 3 o'clock, and I was getting ready to do my filming for the week. I went into my studio, which is right here immediately north of me, and I sit down in my chair, and all of a sudden, my world just started rotating,
Mm.
just spinning, spinning, spinning. And I'm not kidding when I say I had to hold on to the chair to keep from falling out of my chair,
Right.
or at least that's the way it felt. And boy, I sat there wondering what in the world was going on. Well, I needed to take a quick trip to the men's room, but that's 40 miles to the seemingly 40 miles, exaggerating obviously, but it's 40 feet from my office, from a studio. And I'm going, oh my goodness, how am I going to get there? I literally leaned up against the wall
Yeah.
for the duration to walk all the way to the 40 feet to the men's room. Did the same thing on the way back, sat down in my chair and just sat there, took some deep breaths, shook my head, trying to figure out what in the world was going on.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I was able to have a little bit of clarity of thought. I went ahead and filmed 3 videos, made it back into the office, sat down, and boom, everything hit again.
Mm.
And I managed to text Jan and I said, there's something wrong. I'm having a really, really bad vertigo attack. Well, I think she was over here before we hung up,
Right.
to check on me. And it was not only the vertigo, but I just started feeling absolutely horrible. I mean, just awful. And is what's that old saying? I feel like a truck ran over me and backed up and did it all over again.
There you go.
Yeah, kind of the way I started feeling. And so she threw me in a vehicle. We went to the urgent care center. Had to sit there for an hour and a half. Finally got in to see a PA. They did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. They took a specimen and they said, "Okay, this will be at the clinic tomorrow."
Mm.
Well, it wasn't. Here we are over a week later, and we finally talked to them yesterday afternoon, and they said, "Well, we're having trouble finding your file." Great.
That
So
is
we
a
went we went
series
by
of problems.
we went by the center where they were supposed to have sent the specimen, and they said, "We haven't received that yet." Great, great. Left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So by the time we got home, got settled down, and in the meantime, I went to another doctor. They took blood and said, "Think you need to be on some antibiotics. Think you got some kind of an infection somewhere."
Mm.
And so started me on a really powerful antibiotic. We were supposed to have the results from that lab test yesterday afternoon after going on Monday. We still didn't have it until yesterday. No, I'm sorry. Today, my wife and I were sitting at breakfast. The phone rang and said, "Well, we wanted you to know that we got the blood test back, and your blood is too thick. You got too many red blood cells."
Wow.
Okay, well, that could be a problem. That could lead to a stroke, which is what they told me. And on and on. So I've gone to the blood bank, had a pint of maybe a gallon, I don't know, a pint of blood drawn. They said, "Well, you're probably going to feel like a totally different person by the time you get this drawn." Couldn't tell a bit of difference.
Right.
So, and I'm sure that it's all related, but ever since this whole episode began, my blood pressure has spiked up,
Mm.
to an unhealthy level. So I've been taking my blood pressure medicine, which I absolutely hate to do. So in the meantime, like I said, I was going to go to Arkansas to Missouri, excuse me, to be with my brother. He was supposed to have a stent put in.
Right.
Well, the way I was feeling, I couldn't go anywhere. Sure couldn't drive. And so I didn't get to go to be with my brother. My nephew called me late that afternoon after his operation and said, "Well, they couldn't even put a stent in. They got in there and just they discovered that he had already had a stent put in at some
Oh,
point." And I go, "I didn't know anything about this." I talked to my sister later in the
apparently
day.
neither did they.
They did not have record of it, and he didn't remember it. But at some point, he had had a stent put in,
Wow.
and they
Wow.
couldn't put in another one. And so they said, well, we can't do anything anyway because you still got some pneumonia on top of your COPD and on top of your emphysema.
Yeah.
So go home. Oh, great. So to say that my last 2 weeks have been interesting and chaotic and messed up is a huge, huge understatement. For
We
that,
took a week off with a couple of church members here. Went
yeah,
to spend a week in Tennessee, and it rained every single day we were there. But that's okay. The leaves were turning. It was beautiful. Gatlinburg is a beautiful place. That area.
Gatlinburg is gorgeous, gorgeous place. Yeah.
So what you're telling me with your physical condition here is that before you do your programs, the listeners are going to say, "Would you like a complimentary catheter today?"
Yes, or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. This has not been fun. I mean, for the first 3 days after Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday after the Sunday episode, I was sleeping. I would get up my regular time. I didn't go to the office on Monday. No, I take that back. I came to the office and posted my video, went back to the house and slept. But I was sleeping 2 or 3 hours. I'd wake up, I'd eat a bite, I'd lay back down on the couch, sleep another 2 or 3 hours, get up, eat a bite, sleep some more, go to bed, sleep until the next morning.
We may have to work on an AI version of Don Preston that shows the AI Don sitting there. No, maybe not.
Maybe not, maybe not. So anyway, that's the saga of my last 2 weeks, and it has not been fun, but boy, it's good to feel better. Last Friday, last Saturday, my wife and I were getting ready to go out to eat at our regular barbecue place. And
Right.
I knew that I had started to feel better, but stood up, started to walk out the door, and all of a sudden it was almost like you flipped a switch. And I turned to my wife and I said, "Do you know what? I feel more solid and stable on my feet than I felt in a week." I mean, it was just like boom, literally, it was just flip a switch and I felt
Wow.
better. Now I still can't turn around too fast. I still can't get up too fast. Pardon me. But as far as that awful feeling that the world is spinning all the while you're sitting down, uh, that's gone. And so I'm very, very thankful for that.
Well, barbecue has always been helpful to you.
I think barbecue will cure dandruff personally. Okay, well, enough of that.
Okay.
Our respective sagas. Again, thank you for being with me, Larry. I do appreciate it very, very much. So last week, you and Rick Calvert, appreciate Rick filling in with you as well. Rick does a really good job. The two of you make a really good team. And I understand that you went into Galatians chapter 4. Why don't you bring us up to speed and bring us down to where you two got, and we will pick it up from there.
Well, we started where you and he had left off the week before,
Okay.
and we talked about slaves and sonship and the things that Paul talks about beginning there in verse 21, and we went through the allegory and
Ah,
and talked that it's one of my favorite passages anyway,
yeah.
but we went through the parts of the allegory and talked about the relationship between the old and new covenants. When you think about it, Don, people around us, they don't know anything about the old covenant many times.
Mm.
And for most people, it's so foreign because we never lived under the bondage and the hardship of the 613 commandments, going back and forth to the temple, the priesthood, all the elements that were that would weigh a person down. And so it's difficult for those of us under the new covenant to understand what a burden it was to live under that system. And doing the works wouldn't bring salvation. So,
It brought futility.
yeah.
You know,
So,
there's a word that is used, I think it's 32 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And in the Septuagint, it is the Greek word mataiotes, and it means futility.
yeah.
And that's why it is translated vanity, vanity, vanity. And again, I think it's 32 times. in that book. And what is fascinating to me about that word, Larry, is here is Solomon. And he just tells you at the very first of the book, into chapter 3. Here he is, one of the wealthiest men in the world. He's powerful, he's popular, he's got everything in the world that any man could ever possibly want. Now, I've questioned his sanity at times, 900 wives, 1,200 concubines, but hey, that's another story. So he said that he set his hand to do everything that his heart desired. And in chapter 3, he gives a preliminary conclusion to the matter, and he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he uses that word, materiotis.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, he is talking about the fact that all of these materialistic, carnal, we might even say nationalistic type of indulgences and power indulgences that he had never brought him satisfaction.
It's totally defined in the book as life under the sun. It's a horizontal view. It doesn't look up to see God in any shape, form, or fashion, but rather focuses on what your life is apart from God in the horizontal sense of just living in the world without Him.
Yeah. And that's a great point to make. That he said, I set my hands to do everything that I could do, that I had the power, that I had the wealth, I had the influence, everything that I thought that I could do, that that mankind in that horizontal outlook, horizontal perspective, wants to do, and it's summed up, I think, in 1 John chapter 2, 15. Do not follow after the things of the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. For these are not of God, but they're of the world. And that self-absorbed horizontal perspective only brings temporary pleasure, but not satisfaction.
That's right. Well, in chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes, verse 2, he makes this statement. He says, it is the same for all. There's one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good and for the clean and the unclean, for the person who offers sacrifice, for the one who does not offer sacrifice. He's saying it's hopeless.
What's the
It
point?
doesn't matter. We're all going to die. And that's what, living know that they will die in Ecclesiastes 9:5, and it's left there for a minute for people to ponder what he's describing as emptiness
Yeah.
and futility, and
And
yeah,
then, after all is said and done, he comes to his senses. And I think we have kind of an inclusio between chapter 3 and chapter 12,
yeah,
in which he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God. And the King James says, and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. But the whole duty of man is not in the original text. It is fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man.
right.
This is what makes a person. This is what makes us human beings. In other words, what Solomon said he could never attain with his horizontal outlook, now he had come to realize is achieved in a vertical outlook, in a relationship with God. And I think that's such an incredibly powerful message. And in the world in which we are living, Larry, and I don't have to tell you, we're living in a world which is increasingly hedonistic, which is increasingly purely horizontal in its perspective, in its outlook, in its search for meaning, and they're not finding it. There's an interesting thing going on. I don't know if you're aware of this. Let me try to keep from pulling my microphone out because there's an interesting thing going on. Uh, yeah, here we are. Let me
There,
have to dig out from among about 20 or 30 books. This book right here, There you go. The surprising rebirth of belief in God.
Hmm.
Now, this is written by Justin Brierley. Justin
Okay.
is an extremely famous, influential um, broadcasting personality in England, in London. Okay, and he interviews some of the top skeptics, some of the, I mean, very best known atheists in the world, but he also interviews some of the top theological people. And as this title suggests, and what I was saying there is that we live in a world that is so horizontally oriented. Let's just seek pleasure. Let's seek prominence. Let's seek popularity. Let's see, what's the name on my gene? Do I have the right name on my genes today? Or has it changed since yesterday?
Right.
You know, in contrast to this, Mr. Brierley points out he is encountering a growing number of people who have been not just atheists, not just skeptics, but active, militant atheists and skeptics. And we are talking about men and women in the political field, in the scientific world, in the philosophical world, men and women who have lived in open hostility toward faith. They are now turning to Christ.
Yeah, the new atheism hasn't worked out too well for most of them after 20 years or more of this philosophy making headway. The world hasn't improved because of it.
And that's
Not
what
not
they're
a
coming to
lick.
realize. That's exactly the point that Brierley points out. And folks, this is a really, really satisfying. I say satisfying. It's a very challenging book. Uh, it's surprisingly easy to read. Now, due to the very nature of the book, okay, it is anecdotal
Hmm.
to a great extent because he's giving the life story. He's giving the journey of so many of these prominent individuals who have turned from faithlessness to faith. And then he actually indulges in what you and I might label as philosophical reasons why. And
Right.
he talks about, and I've got to tell you, as I read the book, one thing that popped out to me over and over and over again was, okay, so many of these individuals, they're coming back to a belief in the Bible, but they're living in a tremendously hostile world. And these are individuals who do not have an in-depth knowledge of the Bible. They love the Gospels, they love the story of Jesus, all of which is just fine to a certain extent. But they are going to encounter the skepticism of the world in a way that they never have because they're going to encounter the arguments of the atheists that Jesus is a failed prophet.
Right.
So why have you been converted to follow this guy who obviously lied or failed? And Brierley never addresses this potential problem. Never.
Hmm.
The book is fascinating, it's helpful, it's encouraging to see so many very, very, very prominent individuals turning to faith in Jesus Christ. And it would, boy, oh boy, what an incredible thing it would be to be interviewed by Brierley to say, you know what, this is wonderful, but there's a stump in the road that these people need to know about. They need to be prepared to meet it.
What I think is amazing is that if you look back in history, you find the same situation repeated over and over again. The German rationalists came along. They had been skeptical. They didn't believe in inspiration. They didn't believe in a bunch of things. But after they began to examine the text, guess what?
Yeah,
They believed that Jesus fulfilled his promises, or else they said, well, somebody was mistaken somewhere because they could read the text for what it says.
yeah,
I don't agree with German rationalism, but
No.
it's interesting to find their how conflated they were in encountering that and not knowing how to answer it.
Well, and that's the issue to me. They really had no clue on how to answer it. And on my Now TV program, which is every Friday at I think 9:30 of the morning, I just produce it. Alan Morton puts it on there. I don't even know what time it airs, but but anyway, um, my overall umbrella theme has been and continues to be the challenge of Christ. And the reason I did it is because the audience for Now TV is something like a potential of 300 million people, most of whom have no exposure in depth to Christianity. Or if they do, it's kind of a passing surface, superficial type. And these are the people that are the most susceptible to the challenges of the Jews and the Muslims, even the Buddhists and Hindus. Well, look, you're on Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. But if I do, even though you don't believe me, believe the works, that you may know that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. John 10, 37, 38. And so I have been trying to equip my audience there. William McBell has an audience as well, a program there as well. And so trying to equip people to realize there are answers to the skeptics. And to bring us back to Galatians, Larry, to me, one of the ways that we can do that is pointing out what is the nature of eschatology that's set forth in Galatians. It's not historical
No,
eschatology, it is covenant eschatology.
that's right.
And so the passage that you and Rick examined last week, Galatians chapter 4, 21 and following, is a real prime example of that. And allow me to go back very, very quickly. William and I discussed at length that lying at the heart and the core and the very center of Galatians is Paul's discussion of the Abrahamic promise.
He does. I wish. I'm sure that William's book that he wrote on Galatians years ago is still available in
No,
some form.
I don't know if it's in some form or not. I
I
and
have the PDF of it somewhere, but it is such a good treatise on the purpose and intent that Paul wrote Galatians on sonship and inheritance, all
inheritance.
those things. Absolutely.
And like I said, I've been on his case, and lots of other people have been on his case. You got to redo this book. You got to reprint it. Even if you don't expand it, leave it like it is and reprint it.
Right.
It is an outstanding book. And so I'm like William was when he very first started out. As a young minister, I didn't think about Galatians as a book about eschatology. Never really entered my mind. I certainly never heard Church of Christ preachers talk about the eschatology of Galatians.
No.
And furthermore, and this is what William and I talked about for a couple of weeks, at least 3 or 4 weeks, and that is, I never heard ministers in the Church of Christ talk about the eschatology of Abraham
Right.
and the
Eh,
new heaven and the new earth, resurrection and Abraham. I never heard about any of that.
no, we just talked about the end of time, and that was it.
That was just about the extent of it. So, Larry, why don't you walk us through very, very quickly by way of rehearsal? We're almost half out of time, but why don't you walk us through in an overview of what you covered last week with Rick from Galatians 4:21 and following?
Well, we covered the fact that the Apostle Paul here describes in allegorical form taking an actual historical event and people and describing something that has spiritual significance. He says, Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. So here we have Hagar, who is the slave woman in Genesis, and we have Sarah, who's the free woman. And they had two sons with. They had Isaac was born of Sarah, whereas Ishmael was born of Hagar. And then Paul ties that together and he says, these were in the family of Abraham, and it represented the two covenants. that out of Abraham would proceed two covenants. The one by the slave girl, which represented the old covenant with Jerusalem and Israel, the priesthood, sacrificial system, and so on, and the new covenant through Sarah, which was according to the promise to fulfill the promises made to the fathers, Romans 15:8. And he ties it into what was going on at the time in verse 25, where he said it corresponds to the present Jerusalem, which people read this now and they say, well, it's talking about over there, you know.
Yeah.
No, he's talking about the Jerusalem that was present during his time when he wrote this letter. And he talks about the Jerusalem above that is free and is our mother. And so, sonship, inheritance, all that family language is tied into belonging to the new covenant. And the fact is, they couldn't coexist forever. You know, if you have a type and an anti-type, or if you have the relationship between these two ladies and their children, they cannot coexist eternally forever and ever. There is a one that has to be fulfilled and cast out, and that would be uh, Sarah and those born according to the Spirit. And so it says, "Drive out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman." It's about inheritance and the promise that would come through Abraham. And so the believers here in Galatians, they were trying to bind the things of the old covenant and work it into the new covenant. They were saying what it said in Acts 15 there, that unless you keep the Mosaic law and circumcise and so on, you can't be saved. Paul was against that. He said, no, that's not the case. It comes through the fulfilled promises that God made through the cross. So that's basically what we covered.
Okay. Well, let's remind our audience of what William and I covered in the weeks prior to this, and that is the identity of that Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic inheritance, because this is really, and I remember, and of course, I was a whole lot more ignorant then than I am now. I would like to think so, at least. But I remember hearing Max King talk about the inheritance and Abraham and how central it was. And because I was raised in an environment in which I had never ever heard that before, I remember thinking, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit. Okay, yeah, yeah. And but of course, the more I studied, the more I realized it's like, holy cow, wow, he was spot on. Yeah, the Abrahamic covenant, that that really is foundational to biblical eschatology. And to put this in perspective, ladies and gentlemen, the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11 to 16, that Abraham was promised a city and a country.
Right.
We would express that in New Testament terminology as expressed in 2 Peter 3, as expressed in Revelation 21. What he was being promised was a new heaven and a new earth.
That's right.
Well, if Abraham is being promised a new heaven and a new earth, and it was not an earthly city, and it was not an earthly stretch of dirt, which Hebrews 11 makes abundantly clear. You know, if Abraham would have been mindful of the land from which he came out, he could have gone back. He could have had dirt, but he was called to go out to a different city, one that he saw far off. And it was a city whose builder and maker is God. And
And
so
that's
the
what he goes into in Hebrews chapter 12, verses what,
21, yeah.
18 and following.
Yes, exactly.
You know, he talks about the relationship there. He tells these believers, these Jewish Christians that had kind of slid back and were, falling back under the old covenant. He says, no, you're missing the point when you do that, because Um, they were coming to a new heavenly Jerusalem. And the fact is that people today, even in the religious world, they're like, well, yeah, when Jesus comes back, he's going to come down and take the earthly Jerusalem and so on. There is nothing in the Bible that gives us that clue that it goes from the physical or the natural to the spiritual and back to the natural again. That never happens.
Never.
You know, Abraham was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God, not one on the dirt over there in Palestine.
And that is a message that is eschatological to the core and is so incredibly relevant to our present world. Because, folks, if you watch the news, Netanyahu and the leaders in Israel, they say that land that they occupy belongs to them by divine right. They are God's chosen people. And what disturbs me the most about most over almost anything in American politics right now is how this Zionist mentality permeates American politics. And I mean, this goes back some years now, but one of our state legislators, he was actually a U.S. Senator, stood on the floor of the Senate and he said, America must support Israel unconditionally because they are God's chosen people. That land belongs to them forever. And no matter what, we have to support them. And you're going, wait a minute. So, in other words, when I see the Israeli forces killing Palestinian Christians,
Right.
I'm supposed to support that.
No,
No, no,
not
I
per
will
se.
not. I cannot support that. There is no justification for that whatsoever. You know, it's interesting, Larry. I've had countless, I know you have as well, countless discussions uh, with dispensationalists.
Right.
And you try to show them right here in Galatians chapter 4, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the Apostle Paul says, cast out the bondwoman. Well, who's the bondwoman? It's Israel and her son. Well, who's her son? The old covenant. And invariably, I have been told, well, you're completely misusing that text. I go, really? How? Well, it only says cast out the bondwoman's son. That is the old covenant. So the old covenant was cast out. And the very first time I heard that, I go, wait a minute. Did I overlook that? Did I misread that? And I'm going, no, I didn't misread that. Cast out the bondwoman and her son,
Both. Right.
both. And when I started sharing that with my dispensational friends, then they're the ones that were going, wait a minute, I didn't know that was in there. I didn't know that was in there. Yeah, it was old covenant Israel that was to be cast out. And they say, oh, this is replacement theology. And let me do a plug here. I just introduced 2 weeks ago a brand spanking new book entitled Foretold, Failed question mark, Fulfilled question mark, or Future.
Okay. Looking
And
forward to reading that.
it's a little short book, but I've got to tell you, it is incredibly power packed. And it's all on the issue. Well, okay, dispensationalism says you amillennialists and you postmillennialists and you preterists, you're teaching a replacement theology.
No.
God said he would never cast off Israel. God said he would never forsake Israel. And God promised that one of these days at the second coming, all Israel shall be saved. Now, I examine each one of those objections in depth in this little book. And I've got an introductory price on my website, so take advantage of that
Good deal.
while you can. But here's what's interesting, Larry. While the dispensationalists tell us when we go to Galatians chapter 4 and we point out Old Covenant Israel was, guess what, to be replaced. Okay. And when we point out that was always God's plan, then that finger pointing starts. Replacement theology. We are not saying that Israel failed in some unexpected way. What we are saying is that God, from the very, very beginning of Israel's history, even in the time of Jacob, for instance, I'll cite the text here in a moment, even in the time of Jacob, God was predicting a time in which the physical seed of Abraham would no longer be his divine choice. And so, pardon me.
What's amazing about that is the fact that I remember a long time ago, they dispensationalists specifically talk about the church being a parenthesis
Yes.
in time. The first time that I considered it something different in the cross and the parousia of Christ by Max, he shows that Israel, according to the flesh, Old Covenant Israel was the temporary measure to bring about the fulfillment of the promises made to the fathers.
Yep.
And it makes perfect sense that way. They were the gap in there. They
They
were the
were the interim measure.
yes.
And that's what I point out in this new book. And I suggested that this goes all the way back to the time of Jacob, when Jacob wrestled with the angel. In Genesis chapter 28, 15, and 16, after Jacob and the angel have wrestled all night long, the angel says, "You ask of me, and I'll grant you a wish," you know? And he struck him on the thigh. He named that place Bethel, but the angel said, angel of Yahweh said, "I will never leave you or forsake you until I have fulfilled all of my promises that I made to you and to your fathers." Oh, wait a minute. Is this a terminal until? Well, yes, it is, because God promised to Abraham, "In you and your seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed." So it wasn't just Israel, and it certainly was not Israel only that was to be blessed in Abraham,
No.
but it was all nations of the earth. Israel would lose her primacy. Israel would lose her exclusive, to use that term, position, because that was always God's plan. And I can't tell you the number of dispensationalists. When I've shown them that text in Genesis 28, when I've shown them Galatians 4, when I've shown them that God's eternal purpose was to gather together all things in heaven and that are on earth, and including Jew and Gentile in one body in Christ, united and equal.
That's
It's like,
Ephesians right there.
that's Ephesians. That's exactly right. When I've shown them that, it's, in so many instances, it's like the scales fell from their eyes. And they almost couldn't believe it. But when they saw it, they realized that it was truly beautiful. Now, let me say just another couple of things, and I want you to chime in here and add
Okay.
some thoughts. But when we talk about an interim measure, William and I discussed this in Galatians 3:16 and following. Paul makes it abundantly clear. Yeah, there was an interim measure in God's plan, and it was called Israel in the law. The promise of the Abrahamic inheritance could not be received through the law. And Paul says, hey, the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. But after that, the faith has come, we're no longer under the schoolmaster. Well, if we're no longer under schoolmaster, what does that mean? It means that we are approaching the time of the Abrahamic inheritance of the new heaven and new earth. That is so. What Paul is saying in Galatians 3 and into chapter 4 if we can paraphrase it like this, you want to talk about an interim measure? Sure, God had an interim measure. It was called Moses in the law. It was called the Davidic kingdom, if you want to use that terminology. But
And
they all pointed to Christ.
Rick and I last week talked about the pedagogy, the pedagogue, the schoolmaster concept, and what it meant then. I mean, the pedagogy would take the hand of the student and lead him through the whole process, and that's what the purpose of the law was. You know, if you go back under the law today, it still leads you right to the it leads you to Jesus, because that was the point. He was the seed, not seeds as of many, one seed.
Right. And so when one realizes that what we've been going through here in Galatians 3 and chapter 4 is in one very real sense at the very foundation of biblical eschatology. Because we're reaching back to Abraham and the promise of the new heaven and new earth, which could never be achieved through the law, by the law, under the law. Pardon me. But the law was to endure until the time of the inheritance.
That's right.
So, what is the inheritance? New heaven and new earth. And Larry, one of the things that I pointed out, and I develop it in this little small book that I've mentioned already, and I have a larger chapter in this book that I'm writing currently, The Mystery of the Millennium Unveiled. I have an entire chapter on Abraham, the Abrahamic inheritance, and the end of the millennium.
Amen.
You know, I don't know of anybody that denies that the new heaven, new earth comes at the end of the millennium. Okay.
Right.
Well, the new heaven and new earth comes at the end of the millennium. The new heaven and new earth is the Abrahamic inheritance, but the Abrahamic inheritance was supposed to come at the end of the law of Moses.
There you go.
Therefore, the end of the millennium was to come at the end of the law of Moses. That's
If J.S. Russell had made that connection, his parts of his book would have been better.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And I've got that. I make a statement somewhat similar to that
Yeah.
in this manuscript. And I keep finding stuff I've got to put in it. You know, of the making of books, there is no end. Of the expanding of books, there is no end. So, but anyway, yes, J. Stuart Russell, as you rightly pointed out, he struggled with the issue of the millennium.
Yeah.
And finally came down on the view, well, there had to have been a literal rapture in AD 70, which
That's why
is
Mark didn't finish his gospel. He got raptured in the middle of a sentence.
yeah, yeah, maybe so, no, maybe not. But had he understood that Abrahamic promise, he
Right.
would have understood the end of the millennium, in a nutshell, basically. And so this is why this subject, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sorry to say it took me so long to catch on to it. I mean, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, perhaps, I started catching on to the power and the importance of the Abrahamic covenant. But I never essayed on it. I never actually sat down and just systematically went through it as I have done in this little small book and in the larger book on the mystery of the millennium unveiled. And pardon me. And I would even make this observation, Larry. I'm sure that you're aware of the view. There is a view out there that says, well, the millennium began in AD 70.
I've heard that.
Yeah. Well, there's also the view that it's a literal 1,000-year reign that has to extend from AD 70 to the year 1070. Well, that's got to mean that's when the new heaven and new earth comes, which means that that's when the Abrahamic covenant inheritance comes, which is when the law of Moses would end.
Right.
And it just simply does not work.
No, it doesn't work. It's amazing.
I've been going round and round on this issue of when did the law of Moses end? And over and over and over, I've been accosted by this one individual who says, obviously, I'm a false teacher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm leading preterists astray, and I'm leading down the path to corruption and damnation and what have you. Um, but this whole issue of the time of the passing of the law has to do right here in Galatians chapter 4.
Right.
Incredibly powerfully so. And I've used this in formal public debate. I've used this in different debates. When was the law to be cast out? One more time there, Larry?
When the bondwoman at the end of the slave and the son would both be driven out at that time.
Yeah, and here's the question of the day. Why was the bondwoman and her son to be cast out?
Why? That's a good question.
Okay, let me cite it.
What does the text say?
As it was then, even so it is now. The children of the bondwoman did what?
Persecuted
Persecuted
the children of the
the children
free
of
woman,
promise.
which is what was going on at that time.
Bingo. This is Paul's point. Now, Paul could have said, well, the law is going to be cast out because it can't save anyone, which would have been true. He could have said, well, the law is going to be cast out because all of those who are under the law are under a curse, Galatians 3:13. So that's true. So there's an awful lot of stuff he could have said, and he did say it implicitly.
Right.
Okay. He just didn't give us, an extended 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Here are the reasons the law is going to be cast out. But he mentions them, those who are under the law are under a curse. Uh, those of us who are under the law, we know, Paul said, to paraphrase, we know the futility of it. We know that no man can be saved by the works of the law. It is evident because the just shall live by faith. There's a reason it would be cast out. On and on. So the point I'm making here is Paul could have said in Galatians chapter 4, here's a list of reasons why. But he gave the reason for the casting out of the bondwoman and her son as the bondwoman and her son were persecuting the children of the promise. To put this as succinctly as possible, Old Covenant Israel was persecuting New Covenant Israel.
That's right. And
Now,
those who say that the law ended, was done away with at the cross, failed to read in Romans and First Corinthians and throughout there where Paul talks and addresses what he's saying to those who are under the law. How could he say that if the law had been done away with at the cross?
oh yeah.
You know, it the
And
the
not only
verse.
that, let's look at it from the perspective of what I just brought up there.
Yeah,
And that is, as it was then, so it is now. The children of the flesh persecuted the children of the promise.
right.
Therefore, what says the scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for they shall the sons of the flesh shall not be heirs with the promise of the children of the promise. So the reason that Paul gives for the casting out of Israel and the old covenant was the persecution of Christians by the old covenant Israel. Well, Larry, let me ask you a question. You and I were raised in the churches of Christ being taught God took the law away at the cross. He was through with Israel at the cross, right?
That's what we were taught.
That's one of the most fundamental doctrines within
Yeah.
all of the churches of Christ. I mean, that's just foundational in the churches of Christ.
They were cut off at the cross.
They were cut off at the cross. Oh, wait a minute. If the bondwoman, Old Covenant Israel, and her son, the Old Covenant, was to be cast out for persecuting the New Covenant Israel, wouldn't that necessarily demand that Old Covenant Israel had been persecuting the church prior to the cross?
That would have been possible if the church existed prior to the cross.
I never will forget the very first time I used this in a debate. It wasn't a formal public debate. It was there were a lot of people around and everything, and we were talking about it. And this Church Christ minister was just giving me what for, and assuring everybody that I was a false teacher and what have you. But I just said, I've got to ask you a question. I said, what was the reason Paul gave for the casting out of the bondwoman and her son? And he just stared at me. And he said, what is your point? I said, well, I'm asking you a very, very simple question. Paul gave a reason for why the bondwoman, that's Israel, and her son, that's the old covenant, what was the reason they were to be cast out? And he said, well, they were cast out at the cross. I said, why didn't Paul say that? Why didn't Paul say, here's the reason, O covenant of Israel and the law was cast out at the cross? Here's why. Didn't say that. What does the scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for they shall not be, that's a future tense,
Yeah.
the inheritors of the law. He literally had no response whatsoever. And he said, well, you're applying that anachronistically. I said, well, okay, then show me where Old Covenant Israel persecuted the church prior to the cross. He said, oh, you're just completely, totally confused. It's obvious I can't even talk to you about this. This conversation is over. Well, that's one way to do it. Not a good way, and not a proper way, but that's one way to do it.
Sounds like Thanksgiving dinner a lot of times to me. These discussions come up. That's true.
Yeah. So it seems to me, and I'm like you, Galatians 4:21-33 is one of my very favorite passages, and especially in discussions of the end of the law. Because 99% of the people, when they go to discuss the passing of the law, the first thing that they do is that they run to Colossians 2:16-17.
Sure.
Oh, there you see, Paul said that the commandments contained in ordinances was nailed to the cross. That just real clearly says the law ended at the cross. Well, I believed that for years. I taught that for years. I even wrote that in my very first book until I discovered I was just flat dead wrong. That's an abuse of the linguistics of that text. So, we have to learn, as my friend John Anderson used to say years ago before he passed away, unless we're willing to be wrong, we will never be right.
Amen to that. We have to take those steps forward and, test what we're saying, what we're thinking, what we're understanding with the rest of the text to see if it makes any sense.
The very first time he said that to me, we were on the phone. And he said that, and I said, wait a minute. What did you just say? He said, well, unless we're willing to be wrong, we will never be right. And I said, wow, that's pretty profound. I've never heard it expressed quite like that before, but you are exactly right in that.
And I've been wrong a bunch of times, and you've been wrong
I've
sometimes.
been wrong more times than I even like to think about. Probably I'm wrong on some things that I don't know about at this particular point, but I pray to the Lord constantly to give me the humility and the continued open mind, and to grant me the continued joy of study.
Yeah.
To me, there's still nothing. There's not a joy greater in this world, hardly, than the thrill of opening up the Word of God and discovering something that I'd never seen before. That when you learn that, it opens up other doors, which open up other doors, which open up more and more and more vistas.
True.
And the journey, the journey is just an exciting, wonderful, and rewarding journey if we're willing to be wrong.
On Sunday mornings, I get up. When I stand up to preach, I have to glance at my notes to see if I still agree with myself. So,
I know exactly how that feels. I certainly do, my friend. Well, Larry, we are completely out of time. Thank you again for joining me for this evening's Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio. Obviously, we'll have you get back again in the near future.
I look
Appreciate
forward
you
to
very
it.
much, my friend. And with that, I'm going to say good night. God bless.
Good night.
All right, man. Appreciate it very, very much.
It still says we're recording.
Okay, we will. There we are. Now we're done.